What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. Now, I went into today's case never having heard of it before, and my brief initial look into it, I was already like, this is the most devastating story about a peaceful campground, a tent tucked beneath the trees, and a young father that's curled up beside his two little girls. And all of a sudden, by sunrise, he was dead. He was shot in the head while his daughters slept inches away. And reading that just on its own was gut wrenching, especially as someone that's an avid camper. I go camping with my family regularly. But the more I researched, just the more unbelievable this case became. Because what I thought was just one horrific occurrence, which was already one too many, it turned out to be so much more than that. Because for nearly 2 years before that night, gunfire had been echoing through the hills of Malibu Creek State Park. Vehicles hit, campers attacked, victims wounded, but no one ever connected the dots. Or even worse, which seems to be the particular case here, they didn't say anything. Now, the press later called the man responsible the Malibu sniper, but by the time law enforcement acted, 8 victims had already come forward and a family had been completely shattered. This is the story of Tristan Beaudette, and it unwound a horrible history in Malibu Canyon that people had been ignoring for far too long. This was absolutely preventable. So let's go ahead and get right into the details. Tristan Beaudette was one of those people that you just wanted to be around. He was warm, he was humble, and incredibly intelligent. He seemed to be the kind of person that could explain something complicated in a way that made you feel smarter instead of smaller, which is a really unique talent. Usually it's the exact opposite. He grew up in Fresno, California, and he carried this quiet confidence with him wherever he went. He wasn't loud or flashy, but when he did speak, you listened to him because he said everything with such intention. People that knew Tristan described him as being effortlessly brilliant. He never made a point of it, he just was. And his brilliance manifested in the smallest and most beautiful ways. Probably one of the most touching things that I heard was about his daughters. They would ask him questions about the world. And I feel like a lot of parents are very easy to dismiss them, but then there's parents like Tristan. He would find these creative ways to explain these really complex concepts in a way that their young minds could understand. He wanted them to love the world and science and the way things work just as much as he did. Now, Tristan met their mom, Erica Wu, during his senior year of high school. They actually met through a mutual friend that was trying to set him up for a date to winter formal. And so it was almost like a blind date situation, but the two of them hit it off instantly. And what began as a teenage spark ended up growing into a pretty strong lasting bond. They both ended up going to different universities. Tristan spent some time studying abroad, but they remained connected. And ultimately, they became each other's biggest cheerleaders as they both tackled really challenging careers. Now, eventually, Tristan enrolled at UC San Diego and he majored in chemistry. Again, something that somehow came naturally to him. I will never understand it. And not only that, he graduated with the highest GPA of his class. Like, he was incredibly brilliant. And in 2008, he and Erica decided to slow down enough to get married. Their relationship had evolved alongside their lives from these awkward teenage years to college, careers, and finally they were ready to start a family. And when they welcomed their 2 little girls into the world, Tristan stepped into fatherhood so naturally. He loved being a dad. Erica said that Tristan fit into her family seamlessly. He fit into just the family lifestyle in general seamlessly. It felt like something that he had always been a part of. He was so social and laid back and always planning something fun. Like, if there was something that Tristan was good at, it was making sure everyone got together for something fun, whether it was like a beach day, a hike, a weekend camping trip. He was so present for those in his life, living every single day to the fullest. And if you were around Tristan, he was taking you for that ride. No one ever got left behind. Now, by 2018, the family was preparing for a big move to the Bay Area in Northern California. At the time, Erica was studying to become an OBGYN, and she was actually actually getting ready for her board certification exams. Meanwhile, Tristan had just wrapped up his role at a pharmaceutical company called Allergen, and the whole family was gearing up for this new chapter, this big change where both of them could pursue their careers further, grow as a family even more. And to give Erica some quiet study time before she had her boards, Tristan decided to take the girls on a weekend camping trip. And he also wanted to spend some quality time with his in-laws before they moved. It was like this last hurrah before they said goodbye to this phase of life. So they started making their camping trip plans, but what they didn't realize was that the very place they chose was hiding a terrifying pattern. Tristan and his brother-in-law ended up settling on Malibu Creek State Park for the trip. And this particular park is tucked into the Santa Monica Mountains. It stretches more than 8,000 acres of rugged cliffs and oak trees, creeks, there's scenic hiking trails. There's so much to do in this area. And it's also only about 25 miles from downtown LA. So it's like the perfect little getaway from the chaos of like a really fast-paced life. And out there in the park, it feels like a different world. You get to unplug and slow down and take a breath of fresh air. So it was a perfect place to go. And not only that, but the park itself is kind of like iconic in its own way because it's been the backdrop for things like Planet of the Apes, the Sundance Kid, MASH. And so for decades, it wasn't just seen as a safe place to go. It was kind of like a fun adventure. Families camped there, school groups hiked the trails, film crews told their stories, and the exact same open fields. I mean, it was kind of woven into California culture as this place of fun and escape and experiences and not danger. And not only that, but Malibu in itself also just kind of carries this certain reputation. I feel like most of us know Malibu mainly for its celebrity homes. Like there's beautiful ocean views. It's rarely associated with any violence. And according to LAPD statistics, leading up to 2018, Malibu had some of the lowest crime rates in the region. I'm talking like single digits, okay? Violent crime was so rare. Most calls to law enforcement typically involved things like property disputes or traffic incidents. Like everyone living there is just trying to live their best life. Like no one wants to have anything negative happen. They all just want to kumbaya and have a good time. And so for families like the Beaudettes, the idea of camping there didn't raise any red flags. Why would it? And for Tristan, there was also this kind of sentimental attachment to it as well, because years earlier, he and his brother-in-law Scott had actually hiked there, and Tristan loved it so much that it made his bucket list as a place to return with his daughters for a camping trip. And so at this point in time, just before the family's big move, the timing seemed perfect. His brother-in-law Scott and his own kids were also free that weekend, so they headed out on their adventures. They packed up their cars, gathered their gear, and made the short drive up the PCH to spend a couple of nights that should have been beautiful underneath the stars. And that Thursday, June 21st, when they went, was the exact kind of day that you'd hope for. They spent the day at the beach near Malibu Pier. They set their tents up at the campground, made dinner, sat around the campfire. The kids had their bikes and toys and were playing outside. And when the kids went to bed, Scott and Tristan stayed up a little longer talking by the fire. And from the way that Scott has described it, it was just one of those conversations that you're never going to forget. The kind where you talk about how fast life is moving and how grateful you are for family and how bittersweet change can be. They were reflecting on all of their history so far and all the amazing things they had done together and the families they had built and how they didn't want that to change despite the distance. And they were enjoying pre-made drinks that Tristan was known for. I guess he was the guy that had a Manhattan packed away in a tumbler. And so they were having some drinks, enjoying the slow pace. It was a really special moment for both of them, which I'm sure Scott is so thankful for. But eventually, the night came to a close. Tristan and Scott climbed into their tents with their children, and they fell asleep. And then the worst thing imaginable happened. Sometime around 4:30 or 5 a.m. going into June 22nd, Scott ended up being startled awake by a strange popping sound. And initially he thought it might have just been like fireworks in the distance. It possibly could be logs popping from a leftover fire. And he even saw like a flash of light that seemed to connect those possibilities together. And so he didn't really think much of it. However, he then heard one of Tristan's daughters start crying. And initially, he still didn't get up because he believed Tristan would wake up and calm her. But when the little girl kept crying and was joined by her sister, he decided to walk over to their tent and check on them. Now, keep in mind the time of day, it was still pitch black outside. And so as he tried to comfort the girls, he's doing all of this in complete darkness. And one of them just kept on repeating the word wet over and over again. And they were 2 and 4, so it's not like they could really communicate incredibly well at this point. And so he was gently nudging Tristan to try and wake him up, but he was getting no response. He was trying to calm the girls down. And suddenly he noticed that his own hand felt wet. And so he found Tristan's phone and decided to turn it on to use it as a flashlight. And he immediately froze. His hand was covered in blood, and so were both little girls. And Tristan was still not moving. Scott panicked and scooped the girls up and rushed them to a neighboring camper, begging them to watch the girls while he went back to figure out what was going on. And when he went back into the tent, he immediately noticed a small hole. And this was a pretty new tent. There was no reason for there to be holes in it. So that raised immediate concern. And when he was able to put more light on Tristan, he noticed that his face was covered in blood. Tristan had been shot in the head, just inches away from his daughters as they slept. Several people in the campground at this point had startled awake to the girls crying and everyone panicking. And not only that, but some of them had actually heard that same noise that Scott had and started to connect the dots that that was likely a gun that had been shot. The entire conversation, she was there with her daughter and she was terrified that the shooter might still be nearby. And the amount of fear that everyone probably felt in this moment, being in the dark, in the middle of the woods, knowing someone was out there with a gun. So thankfully, first responders arrived fairly quickly and they jumped into action right away, but they realized pretty fast that it was too late for Tristan. And so they shifted their focus to the girls because both of them were covered in so much blood that they couldn't tell if they had been shot or if they were just covered in their father's blood. And so they checked both girls thoroughly, and thankfully neither of them had been hurt. And so by the time the sun rose in the Malibu Canyon, the campground had turned into a crime scene. Now, in the hours following Tristan's death, authorities began combing the entire area for evidence, but what they found, or honestly, rather what they didn't find, immediately raised questions because none of this made sense. There was no sign at all of forced entry into the tent, like no cut marks, no one ripping a zipper off. There were no signs of a scuffle. It appeared he had been shot while he was peacefully sleeping, and even more confusingly, from the outside of the tent. But there were no tire tracks or footprints around that area of the tent, suggesting that someone had driven up and then snuck over to the tent, shot Tristan, and then fled. The campground had been completely quiet. Not a single person there reported seeing a suspicious person. No one heard struggles or cries for help. At most, a few campers heard those sounds that they thought were fireworks or possibly gunshots in the distance, which is important to note. So who on earth had managed to shoot Tristan from a distance through his tent without hitting his daughters in the middle of this 8,000-acre park? Now, Scott told law enforcement at this point that their group had switched campsites several times before they settled in. When they originally got there and tried to set their campsites up at the site they were given, the site was actually at a bit of an angle, and so no one was going to be able to sleep comfortably, so they moved a second time and then finally moved a third time, but that also made it unlikely that this was some sort of targeted attack. No one would have been able to predict where Tristan would have been sleeping that night. They didn't even know where they were going to be sleeping that night until a few hours before. And so they continued searching, and I believe it was like over the first week that they eventually found a shell casing that gave investigators their first real clue. A long 9mm casing, likely from a rifle, was recovered some distance away from the tent, which just confirmed that this shot had not come from up close. This was a calculated long-range strike, a sniper-style shot, and that was terrifying. Who on earth is just sniping campers in the early morning hours in what was considered to be an incredibly safe place? Now, despite how deliberate the act seemed, no one could point to a motive. And Tristan had no enemies. He was well liked in both his professional and his personal life. He worked as a research chemist, and so he was sometimes involved in pharmaceutical testing, which definitely did lead to some online speculation. People were kind of floating around a conspiracy theory that Big Pharma had silenced him, but none of it held weight in the long run. His research was routine, it was uncontroversial. Like, there was no reason for anyone to target him over the next guy that he worked with. Some people also started to speculate that maybe there was a rogue, disgruntled ranger, but when they looked into that, that didn't really fit the bill either, which really only left them with one possibility. This was random. It felt like every single piece, every detail they uncovered made this situation so much more terrifying than it already was. And that also left the question of, if this was random, who else was at risk? This murder shocked the entire community, and it led to so many questions. Keep in mind the statistic that I gave you earlier, that leading up to 2018, violent crime here was in the single digits. This kind of thing did not happen at all. And so people started talking and they started connecting dots, and that's when an even further nightmare began to surface. As the media was scrambling to cover the shocking murder at Malibu Creek State Park, one local reporter couldn't shake the feeling that something was just missing. Cece Woods wasn't a crime journalist at all. She ran a small publication called The Local Malibu, and she focused more on like community stories. She was not someone to look into criminal investigations, but when she woke up the morning of the 22nd and heard the news about Tristan's death and where it happened, obviously being so close to her, she couldn't get it off her mind. And then, as if everyone else sensed it, her inbox started to flood. People trusted Cece. They knew her influence, and they needed her to know that something bigger was happening here. As Cece's inbox flooded, she began digging further and further and started to unravel this web that had been kept secret for 2 years at this point. In just 1 week after Tristan's death, she had uncovered at least 7 other victims who had been shot at in or near the exact same area. All of them had reported their incidents, all of them had been seemingly ignored by authorities, and none of them had been connected. So all over social media in the local area, on Cece's publication, she was out there talking about all these things that she was finding out. These victims were coming forward with their stories, and the more she reported and people began to speak out, the clearer it became that the Lost Hills Sheriff's Department in charge of this area wasn't talking. Not to each other, not to the state park rangers, not to the larger Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, and certainly not to the public. There was something seriously wrong going on in Malibu Canyon, and Tristan Beaudette's death was only the beginning of the fallout. As Cece Woods and the public continued to investigate, what was uncovered wasn't just disturbing, it was enraging. And with each new story that I started reading about, the more wild it became to me that I'd never heard about any of this happening. And I kept like rechecking. I'm like, are we sure this only happened in 2018? Like, am I living under a rock? What on earth? How was all of this going on and this not bigger news than it was? There had been multiple shootings over nearly 2 years, all within the same stretch of Malibu Creek State Park and the surrounding canyon roads. And they were all incredibly similar, not just in proximity, but most of them occurred between 3 and 5 a.m., and nearly all of them were brushed off as isolated incidents. So this brings us to what is known as the very first shooting victim. November 3rd, 2016, a man named James Rogers was sleeping in a hammock at the park. I think he was about a mile or so away from the actual campground, and he had camped there many times before. He was familiar with the area, but in the early morning hours, again around 3 to 4 a.m., he was abruptly jolted awake to a pain in his right arm. And his first thought was that maybe he hung his hammock too low, maybe he rolled onto a rock, and then he thought maybe a bat or some kind of animal possibly had been biting him, and he felt this burning and stinging pain. And so he got up and noticed small holes in his jacket, and when he pulled it off, he saw multiple wounds in his upper arm. And it legitimately looked like something had been gnawing on him while he slept. And so he was still convinced at this point that this was some weird animal encounter. And so he wanted to see what could have possibly done this. So he carefully made his way deeper into the woods, listening for any signs of wildlife, and eventually eventually he was like, you know what? I feel too unsettled to stay here. So he abandoned his camping. He had his girlfriend come and pick him up. And when she saw his arm, they both immediately went to the ER. Now, the doctors treated this guy's injuries, but they didn't have any clear explanation at this point of what happened. They were like, wow, that's gnarly. Like, we're just going to clean it up, give you medicine. And so, again, he's going off this assumption that it was an animal until about a week or so later, when disturbingly, metal pellets began falling out of this guy's arm. He had been shot, specifically with something called birdshot, the kind of ammunition used in shotguns. But that wasn't even the most terrifying part, because when James realized this and thought back to the way that he had been sleeping, he was curled up in his hammock with his right arm kind of like up and over his head, he realized something horrifying. Whoever had shot him may have been aiming for his head. Based on the tight cluster of the pellets and the angle of the entry, the shooter, you guys, had been standing within 5 feet of him as he slept, watching him in the middle of the woods, obviously experiencing one of the most horrifying, creepy things of his entire life. James reported this incident now that it was like a week or so afterwards, but he was bounced between agencies. He was in the middle of the woods, and I mean, he's in a state park. You've got so many different jurisdictions that are kind of figuring out how to deal with this area of land, and no one would really help him out. And so by the end of it, nothing was really done. Like, how someone gets shot in the arm from 5 feet away in the middle of the night in the middle of the woods and it's not taken seriously is absolutely beyond me. And so obviously, since no one did anything, the shootings didn't stop. About a week after James Rogers' attack, so probably around the same time that he was reporting it, another camper was targeted in the same general area of Malibu Creek State Park. Victim number 2 was a man that was camping literally in the same corner of the park, only a couple of sites away from where Tristan would eventually be killed 2 years later. And in those same early morning hours of November 2016, he was shot while inside of his camper. And again, it was birdshot. This incident was reported, but just like with James, nothing was done. There was no press, no warning, no in-depth investigation, all was quiet. And it's just so crazy to me to think that James was reporting his birdshot shooting with pellets falling out of his arm at the exact same time this man was shot at through his camper. How did no one see that and say, you know what? We should probably look into this. And that brings us to victims number 3 and 4. Just 2 months after James' shooting and the camper shooting in January of 2017, Melissa Tangelo and her boyfriend were camping in their car in Malibu Creek State Park at the campground, and around 3:30 a.m. they heard a metallic clinking, and she described it as sounding like someone hit like a baseball bat to pavement. And so it was kind of weird. They also noticed it smelled like something burning, but they just figured it was noise from a nearby camper or maybe something fell, you never know. And so they rolled over and went back to sleep because they didn't hear anything else after this until later that morning. Melissa noticed a strange noise. It sounded almost like a marble rolling around in the back of her car. And so she got out and went around to go and check and saw a hole in the back of her vehicle and what appeared to be a large metal slug from a shotgun lodged in the back. And she's looking at this and is checking the angle and remembering where she slept. And if it had been like any higher at all, that would have hit her as she had been sleeping. And so she immediately reported this incident as well. It took over 2 hours after reporting it for law enforcement to show up. I think it was park rangers that actually showed up, so it wasn't a sheriff's deputy or anything like that. But when they did show up, finally, 2 hours later, they seemed so nonchalant about the whole ordeal. We're talking about the same campground where someone else had been shot at 2 months prior. So this whole like it was different jurisdictions thing, I personally think is a load of absolute crap. But they just weren't really worried about what was going on. And Melissa was so frustrated by this and even said, you know, would you have come faster if I had been dead? Like, there seemed to be no urgency or concern. And so this officer took the slug, but there seemed to be no follow-up investigation, just like the other 2 shootings. There was no warning to the public. It was just more silence. And so from this point on, there seemed to be a gap in the shootings. 11 months passed before there was another. But it's likely, in my opinion at least, because the shooter was planning a new tactic. Sleeping campers, I guess, were no longer fun targets. I mean, at this point, this person had shot at 3 separate people and potentially not been successful in what he hoped would happen. And so he moved along to moving vehicles. And this brings us to victim number 5 in the summer of 2017. There was a man driving a white Porsche down Malibu Canyon Road, which is a incredibly busy winding stretch that cuts through the Santa Monica Mountains. It's a main thoroughfare for a lot of locals and visitors alike. And while he was driving in the early morning hours, he heard the horrifying sound of something hitting his car. And so shaken, he pulled over, figuring it was a rock or something like that. But when he looked at it, he realized that's not at all what happened, because the back of his car was sprayed with birdshot. And so he immediately called 911. Just like Melissa Tangelo, he waited for what seemed like forever after being shot at. He waited for nearly 30 minutes. And I can only imagine he was thinking the entire time, where did this person shoot me from? Is there someone up here in this canyon watching me? I have to shoot it from relatively close by. And so I'm sure he was thinking this person could be like 20, 30 feet away from me and I just don't know it. And so when a patrol car finally came into view about 30 minutes after he had called 911, he finally took a breath until that patrol car drove straight past him. I wish I was making these things up, but I'm not. Which, by the way, typically if someone is off on the side of the road, pulled over, clearly in distress or, possibly needing help, officers usually will stop and make sure they're okay. So the fact that this officer didn't even do that is just bewildering to me. But this guy had to drive himself to the Lost Hills Sheriff Station, bullet holes still visible in the vehicle and all, and be like, I literally called y'all and nobody showed up. And so while he's there, the deputies reportedly used a knife and bare hands to dig out the metal fragment, and then that was it. Unbelievably, they failed to enter it as evidence into any official system. No case was opened. They were like, oh, we don't know what happened. That's so crazy. And he was sent on his way. It was just a shrug and a file that quietly disappeared. And so this brings us to victim number 6 and a couple more technically, because I think there was more than one person in the car. So a white BMW carrying teenage girls on their way to a surf competition was also struck that same summer in Malibu Canyon. The back of the windshield shattered completely, and these are teenage girls. And so when this happened, they were not about to stop, and terrified that this person was close by, they sped to the coast before they decided to see what was going on. And it seems obvious to me based on their actions, they immediately knew what had hit them was not a rock, that this was someone shooting at them. And when they did get out and look, once they were safely parked far away from the area this happened, they too saw that their car had been riddled with birdshot. And I bet you can guess what I'm going to say next. The incident was reported and nothing came of it. It was as if every single incident existed in its own little bubble. And as I said before, there were lots of different jurisdictions and people looking into all of this, but I don't think all these incidents went completely separate agencies. I mean, these 2 before Tristan in the campground, which the same rangers probably responded to. The stretch of Malibu Canyon Road is in Lost Hills jurisdiction, and so I'm just not understanding how no one connected the dots. And this brings us to victim number 7. And every single victim so far has been so infuriating and devastating to hear their stories, but something about this particular one makes me so much angrier. And it's probably because this shooting occurred just 4 days before Tristan Beaudette was murdered right beside his children. Victim number 7, Ian Kincaid, on June 18th, 2018. He was driving his car through the canyon at around 4 a.m. when something struck his hood. Okay, so like someone's now shooting at the front of the car instead of the back of the car, which in my opinion is important to note. And like a few others, he too assumed it must have been a rock. When he looked closer, there was no way. His windshield was cracked. It was spider webbing in a way that was consistent with a bullet. And so he immediately filed a report. Doesn't seem like anyone came out to meet him. No one asked him to come to the station. Deputies never retrieved a bullet from his car. They never reached out to ask him questions. Someone just took this report and, like all of the others, slid it away to never be spoken about again. And so to hear that all of these things had unfolded over the last few years, and 4 days after that last incident where no one did a damn thing, Tristan Beaudette was murdered, The community was pissed, to say the least, and I can only imagine what it felt like for Tristan's family to know that there was this whole string of shootings leading up to his murder. And had he known this was happening, he never, ever would have gone to that park. It was obvious, even to the civilian population, just everyday people, that these weren't random events. They weren't coincidental. But law enforcement seemed to be refusing to call it what it was, even after Tristan Beaudette's shooting. The entire time these shootings were going down, the park was never shut down. They never investigated it deeply. Even bare minimum, they never issued a warning to the public that these things were going on so they could make their own informed decisions and protect themselves. They just let this continue. And I'm going to bring up this jurisdiction thing again because it's made me so angry throughout looking through this entire case. If there had been all these different instances where no one knew about it, that would be one thing. But that's not what was going on here, because behind the scenes, the few deputies who did notice this pattern, they were being silenced. While the public remained in the dark all of those 2 years, there were people inside Lost Hills Sheriff's Department that saw what happened, and they were trying to sound the alarm. Two names in particular stand out, and that's Detective James Royal and Deputy Wright, both of them based out of Lost Hills Station. And they were among the first within the department to notice that something about these shootings wasn't right. I think it was by that January shooting in 2017, which had been the third. They were noticing the pattern in the hours, who was being shot, that it was happening in a really tight geographic cluster. And so Royal and Wright both urged their superiors to take it seriously. I mean, they legitimately were worried these weren't isolated events, that this area might be home to a pattern of targeted violence, that someone was potentially using Malibu Canyon like a hunting ground. And they were so concerned, they even said they believed this person would escalate to become a serial killer, that was likely their intention this entire time, but instead of support, their concerns were downplayed. And I just want to note that neither of these were like fresh green detectives or deputies. And so while the department was telling them, nope, y'all are being dramatic, this isn't actually happening, behind the scenes, fear was already spreading through the entire department. Other deputies began warning their own families not to take Malibu Canyon Road. So these people were warning their families, they were so worried, but didn't think it was important to warn the public. And not just that, the deputies themselves seemed terrified to go in this area during that particular early morning time frame, and really just at all. Allegedly, some of them would race through the canyon, like go through as fast as they could in this particular area with their loaded weapon, arms out the window, hoping that if someone was watching them from the hills and saw them racing through with their gun out, they would think twice about pulling the trigger. So why on earth were so many superiors ignoring it? There were still no public warnings issued, no alerts, no investigation updates. The park remained open. Families continued hiking and camping and driving through the area, completely unaware of how many others had already been attacked and unaware that their own law enforcement there to protect them was so scared they were booking it through the canyon themselves. And then in June 2018, Tristan Beaudette was killed. Royal and Wright were devastated because this is the exact outcome they had feared and tried so desperately to prevent. And now there was a father that was dead, gunned down beside his young daughters. And instead of admitting the warning signs that had been there all along, the department continued to downplay the situation. And it wasn't until public outcry, led by CeCe Woods mainly, hit national headlines that the sheriff's department finally decided to schedule a public meeting. But behind closed doors, Royal later claimed that he and others were given strict orders that day to deny the pattern, say the park was safe, and stick to the script. He did what he was told, but that moment, standing before these grieving families and telling them there was no threat, that stuck with him.
Many of you, including myself, have serious concerns.
A packed house as concerned residents turn out for a Malibu Creek community safety meeting. Their number one worry, the unsolved murder of a father shot and killed while camping at Malibu Creek State Park.
I'm concerned. I have 3 daughters in the area that are young, and I worry about it, and they ride horses all over the mountains and in the center, so that part of it's really concerning.
State Senator Henry Stern organizing the meeting with law enforcement and park officials as they try to calm fears following the brutal murder and news of a series of shootings in the area over the last several years.
There's got to be an ongoing vigilance about public safety in these mountains. We have 250,000 visitors every year. It should not be a place where you worry about the safety of your kids or your family.
Tristan Beaudette was shot in the head inside his tent while camping with his 2 young daughters this past June. There have been at least half a dozen other shootings in or near the park in recent years, some seriously injured. But investigators say they don't believe the same suspect is responsible.
There were large gaps in time. There was no confirmed connection. And remember, even now, there's no confirmed connection.
The campgrounds at Malibu Creek State Park remain closed as the investigation continues. Authorities say they made the move out of an abundance of caution.
Just know that every one of us has nothing but the top priority of maintaining your safety and public safety in general in the Santa Monica Mountains.
And the community at this point were, honestly, it seems flabbergasted because they all saw these connections. I mean, it wasn't like all of these victims had been killed. One had been killed. There were still 7 of them alive and well saying, hello, something's going on here. So Royal and Wright continued doing their jobs. They kept pushing. They wanted answers. And just a few months later, when a strange burglary occurred nearby, it would be those same 2 officers that pushed the investigation forward, finally leading authorities to the man they believe was responsible. On October 4th, 2018, there was a break-in reported at a small business in the Malibu area. And at first glance, it seemed minor. A window had been smashed, some basic items had been taken, but it was things like food and water and batteries. It was not like expensive things that someone was taking to resell or enjoy. It was just necessities to live. And so when investigators reviewed the surveillance to try to figure out who was doing this, figuring it was someone who was potentially homeless, what they saw changed everything, because the person that had broken into this business was dressed in full black tactical gear, including a mask, had a backpack on, and slung over his shoulder, kind of tucked into the backpack, was a rifle. And if you remember back to the casing they found in Tristan's investigation, it was a long 9mm. He looked like someone who had been living in the wilderness, a survivalist who was living off of stolen supplies, clearly with a rifle in his backpack, staying ready for confrontation. And so they believed, first of all, they needed to find this guy, but also that he might be involved in at least Tristan's shootings, if not more. And so they took still shots from the surveillance footage and released it to the public, and law enforcement quickly began comparing other recent burglaries to see if this person was behind even more. And thankfully, this time they used their pattern recognition skills, thank goodness, and noticed that there had been several break-ins in locations where only survival items had been taken. The same methods of break-in, food, water, batteries, and the same surveillance showing a man in tactical gear with a rifle. And all of these locations where there had been these break-ins, they were all within close range of Malibu Creek State Park, the same place where Tristan Beaudette had been killed, the same place all of these people had been shot at. Not only that, but I ended up finding out that this whole area where all this was happening was legitimately in the sheriff department's backyard. I mean, this man had likely waltzed through their parking lot, and all of this was happening right behind them. And they had no damn idea, okay? But at least at this point, they were getting closer. And so once they released these stills, everyone in the public, because again, things like this don't happen here, they were all on the alert. By October 6th, they ended up getting a tip. There was a Malibu Park maintenance worker that had been driving through the area when he was, I guess, flagged down by a man dressed in said tactical gear. And he pulled over to talk to this guy. I would have turned around and booked it in the opposite direction. But this man in tactical gear, I guess, asked for a ride and then made a comment, something along the lines of, man, there's a lot of cops out here right now. And so thankfully, this worker refused, was like, I'm not taking you anywhere. You can go take your tactical yourself back into the mountains far away from me. And he immediately reported the encounter to the police. And the description perfectly matched the man from the burglary footage. And so they're like, we've got our guy. He's somewhere in the middle of the park wandering around. And so within hours, search teams descended on Malibu Creek State Park. And so they had people out on foot. foot, they had canine units, they brought in helicopters, they brought in drones, anything at all to help find this guy. But if you've ever been to this area, which I haven't, but I love Google Maps and spending time on there and kind of just seeing things from above, this looks like incredibly challenging terrains. Like if you're not on a path, you are going down like ravines, you are possibly throwing yourself off a cliff accidentally. It does not look like fun. This man had already vanished into the brush, which clearly meant he was incredibly comfortable in this area and knew exactly where to go. I mean, he literally disappeared like smoke. But thankfully, it still wasn't over because this man seemed to feel untouchable. And so just days later, on October 9th, technically into the early morning hours of the 10th, another break-in occurred. And this time, it was at the Agora Hills Community Center. The MO was exactly the same of this man they were looking for. A window smashed, food and water taken, matching surveillance. But there was one thing different about this particular instance. The suspect left boot prints behind. So tracking dogs were brought in. I mean, they had like the SWAT team. Everyone was out there to try to find this guy. And the scent trail paired with the footprints led deep into the Santa Monica Mountains, just 2 miles away from Malibu Creek State Park. They searched endlessly. And just as they were about to give up, an officer heard something. It sounded like this faint metallic clinking, like gear shifting or possibly tools moving, maybe someone messing around with a weapon. So this officer raised his rifle scope and scanned the hillside, and on a ridge in the distance, partially obscured by brush, he spotted a makeshift encampment. And in it, a man wearing tactical gear carrying a rifle. And so they immediately descended upon this man. So right there in the middle of the Santa Monica Mountains, this man was arrested on the spot, and his name was Anthony Rauda. Anthony Rauda was a 42-year-old survivalist with a very long criminal history. He had a rap sheet spanning 2 decades, and it wasn't just small things, okay? He had prior convictions for possessing explosives, loaded firearms despite being a felon, trespassing with weapons. He'd been in and out of state prison, and he was on active probation when he was arrested. And because, again, he was a felon and on active probation, he should not have been carrying a rifle. But they were able to say for sure, up close and personal with it, that that rifle was a 9mm, just like the one that shot Tristan. Now, to get a little bit into Rauda's background, he had been living off-grid, surviving in the mountains above Malibu, less than 2 miles away from where Tristan had been shot. And so all of these things are lining up. He was also clearly organized. His camp was combed over, and they found tons of supplies for survival, food, water, trail mix, camping gear. A lot of it had actually directly been connected to some of the things stolen at these different break-ins. He had hardware materials like nails and metal pipes, screws, which alarmingly are components that could be used to build homemade weapons. And he didn't seem to have like any sort of sophisticated living arrangement. It was like tarps connected to trees. So what other reason would he have for all these metal pipes and nails and screws, especially with all of his weapons charges in the past? And they also found 7 electronic devices, including phones and a laptop, all of them heavily weathered, but definitely recoverable by digital forensic experts. Like he still was keeping some sort of contact with civilization. But what they weren't finding was a shotgun, which was pretty significant because many of the earlier attacks before Tristan all involved birdshot, which is typically fired from a shotgun or a homemade zip gun, which is made out of things like pipes and screws and nails and all of those kinds of things. But they didn't find that either. But regardless, authorities had no doubt at this point that this man was responsible for not only the burglaries, but very likely for Tristan's shooting and very possibly the other shootings as well, which was a complete 180 from where the sheriff's department was standing before Anthony was caught. Initially, he was only arrested because he had a weapon on him, because of his parole violation. They couldn't conclusively at this point tie him to more crimes. So investigators immediately dove in to analyzing the digital evidence found at his camp and other things to figure out if he could be responsible. And since they didn't find any sort of shotgun style weapon or a zip gun, that digital evidence was kind of all they really had at that point. And what they uncovered just from that alone was pretty damning. On one device, they ended up finding downloaded manuals and PDF guides on how to make a zip gun. So everything seemed to be coming full circle. They hadn't physically found a zip gun, but he had obviously been learning how to make one. Other electronics contained books and diagrams on homemade firearms, instructions on building triggers from nails, and other DIY construction content. There was also like a lot of like doomsday kind of thing, like post-apocalyptic kind of stuff. Like he wanted to live in a way where he scavenged. We're talking like the Last of Us kind of situation. And given how he was living, breaking into these buildings with rocks and living in the woods with things that he found, clearly he was taking advice from these different books. So who's to say he hadn't also already built this zip gun? But there were also really scary search queries, including bullet hits gas tank, 9mm incendiary bullet. So this seemed to possibly tie him to the shootings of all those cars going down Malibu Canyon Road. And not just that, he was clearly trying to make the cars explode by hitting the gas tank. And perhaps most haunting of all, breaking news headlines. And that particular search was done just 10 minutes after Tristan was shot. And one of Rauda's devices had been pinged in the vicinity of the campground just an hour before Tristan was murdered. So Anthony Rauda had been out there in the dark using his phone near Tristan's campground, likely scoping out a victim. And within 10 minutes of making that shot, when everyone was in a panic, 911 was being called, he was looking to see if news had already hit. And this wasn't the only time a device of his pinged near the sites of the earlier shootings either. It's not incredibly clear how many times his digital footprint placed him repeatedly in the same areas where victims had been shot, but ballistics testing ultimately confirmed the most important piece of it all in Tristan's case. The 9mm bullet that killed Tristan had been fired from the same rifle Rauda was carrying when he was arrested. They had pulled a bullet fragment out of Tristan's shoulder blade, and it was a match. So at least they seemed to be getting answers, definitive answers, in one of these 8 separate cases, but there were still so many questions that remained, not just for authorities, but for the public. There were also a lot of people that weren't necessarily convinced that Rauda was actually behind any of this. If the attacker had been firing on victims using birdshot, why wasn't there a shotgun found? If this guy had built zip guns, why wasn't one recovered? It all felt really convenient to a lot of people. And from my understanding, there just wasn't a great relationship between the community and the sheriff at the time. I guess it was an election year this year, and so that was already kind of raising tensions, but a lot of people started to believe that, they went from one extreme to the other. There was this big response just months before the election during the campaigning where the public wasn't happy with how the sheriff's office had dealt with 2 years of crimes and violent crimes at that. All of a sudden, they had captured the one person responsible. And then came another devastating blow to the investigation. Just a few weeks after Rauda's arrest, a wildfire ripped through the Santa Monica Mountains, decimating everything in its path, including the very campsite where Rauda had been living. So anything that hadn't already been collected, it was gone, destroyed. And so that meant there was no chance to find a discarded zip gun that they maybe missed. There could be no further analysis of scattered shell casings that might be in the area, no opportunity to see if a buried shotgun had been missed. So everyone just had to hope that authorities had enough. Now, thankfully, before the fire, some photos of Rauda's camp had been taken, and I guess people in the community had seen them. And someone noticed one thing. In one of the images near the center of the camp, there was a piece of wood that could be kind of seen sitting underneath leaves and all these different things. And it had obviously been like crudely cut and hand carved. There were a random series of like drilled holes and grooves. And when they looked at it closer, it seemed obvious that it was possibly a zip gun component, maybe a mounting plate or a stabilizer. And so this just infuriated people further because it felt like there had in fact actually been something there, something to tie this man to the rest of the attacks. This wooden piece could have been the last piece of the puzzle to connect all of those things together but now it was all ash. But with all of the evidence that they did have at this point, by January of 2019, a whole collection of charges were slapped on Rauda. He was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder in the death of Tristan Beaudette, 10 counts of attempted murder for all of those shootings, including charges for Tristan's 2 daughters that were right beside him when he was shot, and 5 counts of second-degree burglary tied to all of those survivalist thefts. And Rauda, from the very get-go, made it clear he was not going to cooperate. Not with investigators, not with the judges, not even with his own legal counsel.
Yeah, Michael, good morning. Authorities arrested Anthony Rauda 4 months ago on a parole violation, and he's been in custody ever since, and the campground here has remained closed. Well, now this morning, he's facing a murder charge and more than a dozen others. Rauda appearing in court Monday for his arraignment, hiding from cameras.
You agree to that, sir?
Charged with murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, and 5 counts of second-degree burglary. Police believe Rauda had been terrorizing the area since 2016, allegedly shooting this man who was sleeping in a hammock.
I just woke up to a stinging pain in my arm. I felt the cold breeze on my arm through the hammock, which was weird.
And police also say Rauda allegedly fired shots into vehicles passing by.
At first, I thought someone put a sticker on my car. Then my boyfriend walked around and he was like, "That's a bullet hole."
Rauda under restraints and a spit mask in court last month, convicted of several robberies in the area. And police say since his arrest, there have been no further shootings, putting the California community at ease.
And that ended up setting the stage for one of the most volatile trials Los Angeles County had seen in years. Anthony Rauda's trial did not start right away. In fact, it ended up being delayed actually for years. There were lots of different legal challenges, psychiatric evaluations, and Rauda's own violent behavior behind bars. From the very beginning, he was combative and uncooperative. At his very first court appearance in March 2020, Rauda was wheeled into the courtroom wearing a spit hood. He had fired his lawyers immediately, and the case ended up being postponed again until he could find new representation, which for a while, he decided he was just going to represent himself. He ended up assaulting 2 deputies. Both of those incidents were caught on surveillance footage, and because of that, he was later sentenced to an additional 3 years and 8 months in prison for those attacks. And at nearly every single one of his hearings, he either refused to speak or he had to be restrained and escorted in a chair. The obscene words that he was just throwing at these judges, it was honestly a little crazy to hear. And on several occasions, he even declined to attend, saying that the process of being put in a chair and wheeled into the courtroom due to his own behavior was punishment enough. So he just refused to go altogether. And Anthony Rauda's past seemed to kind of offer insight into how he ended up here. Now, according to his family, he had once been a really quiet and thoughtful kid. I mean, he was really chill, kept to himself, well-behaved, but his family said that something in his teenage years shifted. And so as he got older, he did try his hand at a few different paths in life, career choices, but ultimately he made a decision that society wasn't for him. And so instead, he chose to live off grid, isolated, homeless by choice, surviving off the land. And his family tried to keep him tethered, at the very least, to some kind of normalcy. They tried to encourage him to stay in contact with them, to stay social, but they said that he just kept slipping further and further into isolation. And along the way, he developed a deeper sense of paranoia, along with a deep-rooted hatred for law enforcement, very particularly the Lost Hills Sheriff's Department. Over the years, Rauda had racked up multiple charges in Lost Hills jurisdiction alone, everything from public intoxication to fighting in public. And despite the fact that the charges he got were due to the consequences of his own actions, he instead accused deputies of harassing him and targeting him. And in one particularly disturbing encounter, deputies responded to a call about a man that was Rauda passed out in someone's yard. And when they arrived, they found him there dressed in full tactical gear again, unconscious with a backpack full of contraband. And it's like he wasn't understanding why no one was letting him live that kind of life. And so they were the ones that were the problem. And so obviously when you pass out drunk in tactical gear with contraband and weapons and explosives in your backpack, that led to serious charges. And it just angered Anthony Rauda even more. And he even said that he had all of those things for his own protection from law enforcement. So there was just a really bad relationship between Anthony Rauda and the police department. And I also found it kind of interesting that the police department had already known Anthony Rauda to be someone wandering around in this tactical gear with this history of weapons charges. And so I genuinely wonder if his name popped into any of their minds when all of these shootings started to occur. So over the course of years, Anthony Rauda just became more and more isolated. I mean, he stopped reaching out to family. His family actually went out into these mountains to try to find him and help him several times, but he just didn't want it. He just wanted to be on his own. And so I'm sure it was very jarring for him to be brought into a jail and being restricted to a room and having to be around all these people. And so that aggression and violence was just exacerbated in this situation. And so this aggravated and paranoid behavior ended up leading to them questioning his competence to stand trial, because they're like, he's clearly not okay. Like, there's something going on here. And so they ended up doing psychological evaluations, but he ended up being found to be sound of mind. So they continued forward and just took all these different extra precautions to make sure that he was not able to harm anyone else during any of his proceedings. And so finally, by early 2023, the long-awaited trial began. And this was really the first time that the public was going to be hearing everything about the case. Now, the prosecution argued that Anthony Rauda had been stalking campers. He was testing these homemade weapons he was learning to build, and he ended up escalating from this birdshot to lethal precision with this rifle. It was like he was testing out all of these things he was learning and seeing how far he could push it to get to his ultimate goal, whatever that goal may have been. And so they were referring to him as a predator. They were saying he was using the cover of night and the isolation of the park to target people that were most vulnerable, people that were sleeping in their tents, their cars, or their hammocks. And they even think that the time that he attacked was purposeful, because that is usually when people are in their deepest sleep. Presented the digital trail found on his devices. They introduced all the evidence in ballistics. And the prosecution strongly argued that while they didn't have the actual weapon used in the other 7 shootings, that they so strongly believed Anthony Rauda was behind it. That digital data was placing him at some of these locations at the time of these shootings, but the defense very strongly pushed back. As I said, Rauda chose to represent himself for a portion of the proceedings, but he did eventually end up with a court-appointed attorney, and the defense's strategy was mainly built on reasonable doubt. They argued that there were no eyewitnesses to Tristan's murder or any of the shootings. Everyone had been asleep at this time, so of course there's not going to be eyewitnesses. They also argued about the crime scene because, unfortunately, Tristan's tent, for whatever reason, by park rangers, ended up being thrown away. Now, why they would throw away one of the largest pieces of evidence of the crime scene being, the crime scene literally itself, is beyond me. So no further testing could be done on that. There also were apparently cigarette butts that had been found near the scene, possibly in the area where they believed the shots might have been fired. And they did do DNA testing on it to see if they could further connect Rauda to the crime, but it wasn't his DNA. There also was no recovered zip gun, as we already know, no shotgun found. So the defense argued that the state could not tie Rauda to any of those birdshot attacks. And they also suggested that some of the digital evidence was circumstantial, that just being near the park or searching for those violent terms online didn't necessarily prove that he pulled the trigger. But despite their efforts, the jury appeared to see right through it. The jury reached a decision and they found Anthony Rauda guilty of several of the charges. He was found guilty of second-degree murder, so not first, in the death of Tristan Beaudette. They also found him guilty for 3 of the 10 counts of attempted murder, specifically 2 regarding Tristan's daughters, and also that last shooting at Ian Kincaid, the one that occurred 4 days before Tristan's shooting. They also found him guilty for all 5 burglary charges. Now, I was really curious about them finding him guilty of second-degree murder and not first, and I've seen it stated that they could not find premeditation, which is a requisite for finding someone guilty of first-degree murder. They have to have everything premeditated, planned out, and I don't understand how they didn't find that, because I feel like, considering the fact he would have to wake up, walk through the woods with a weapon in very specific early morning hours. I mean, he made the decision to walk a mile or so from his campground in complete darkness, specifically to this campsite, and shot from several yards away directly into the tent where Tristan was sleeping. You don't just randomly do that. Like, that's not something you randomly decide to do before he even acted. So I just don't get how that's not considered premeditation. So that is what they ended up settling on. But I will say I wasn't too surprised they didn't connect him to all of the shootings that had occurred from 2016 on, because while it did seem there was some data suggesting he was in the same areas at the times these shootings occurred, they didn't have the weapon.
Beaudette's wife spoke of her loss.
He was my best friend, my partner, my co-parent, the love of my life. And on the day that he died, we lost more than just who he was as a person. We lost the entire future that we had planned.
And that you were actually found with a 9mm. You researched that. You researched how to use the sights. You researched how to use it. You researched, I guess there was a video and part of the clip was how to clean it. But you took it even a step farther. You modified it. So it was easy for you to sling over your shoulder and lurk around in the middle of the night. You're a smart guy. And that's a dangerous combination, cold-blooded and smart. To show that, you're smart enough to waive your presence during the jury. That spoke volumes. Because you know how you've acted before. You know why you're in that chair. You know why you have a net over your head. Previously, you've threatened everybody in court. Everybody. You use profanity often towards people in a violent way. You stabbed a deputy. You punched a deputy. You had multiple incidents in jail. One as early as just, I think, less than 30 days before this trial.
The judge made their stance very clear at sentencing, saying, quote, "This case was chilling. It was violent. It was cold-blooded. There's absolutely no remorse. It's like somebody's worst nightmare. I've been around a long time as an attorney, as a judge. I've seen many dangerous people. And Mr. Rauda, you rank among the top in terms of your danger to the community." And so because of that, they opted for the harshest sentencing. Anthony Rauda was sentenced to 119 years to life in prison. But again, even after that verdict, there were so many questions that remained and people were still left unsettled because it seems like there is a split. Not everyone believes that Anthony is behind all of the shootings, and they're concerned that maybe there is someone else out there. And I think probably one of the main reasons a lot of people feel this way is because weeks after Anthony Rauda was arrested, someone else claimed to have been shot at, and it clearly could not have been Rauda. On October 28th, 2018, just 3 weeks after Rauda was taken into custody on the side of the Santa Monica Mountains, a woman contacted Cece Woods saying that her daughter was driving down Malibu Canyon Road when something struck the car with force. And authorities were called. They came out, checked everything out, and said that it was probably a rock, that there was just like this big fear and paranoia happening. But photos of the damage to some people tells a different story. It looked nearly identical to the bullet impacts that were seen in a lot of the previous car shootings. And it apparently wasn't the only report that there was still gunfire happening all along the canyon. Some of the residents that lived around that area said that they continued to hear early morning gunfire echoing around even though Rauda had been arrested. And so I understand why there was a lot of fear that there was someone else out there, but I haven't seen any other reports since then. So I honestly don't really know what to believe. Maybe someone was out there trying to be a copycat, or people were out there trying to scare the crap out of people still. And I just feel like the chances there's more than one person out there doing something like this is slim to none. Or maybe I just want to make myself feel better for all of the people that have to continue living in that area, knowing that if there is someone else out there, the authorities might not do anything about it. On that note, the battle for accountability was not over. People were very upset with the way that the sheriff's department handled this. And so in 2019, Erica Wu, Tristan's wife, filed a $90 million wrongful death lawsuit against the state of California and Los Angeles County. Her entire case was built on the devastating truth that this didn't have to happen. It never should have happened. And she was backed by so many people who felt the same. One quote directly from the lawsuit read, quote, "Had decedent Tristan Beaudette known of the prior shootings, he would have never brought himself or his young daughters to camp, thereby putting his daughters and himself at severe risk." But the response from the state and the county was so cold and technical and unfortunately unsurprising, because they argued that there was no specific law requiring them to warn the public about the prior shootings. And they even went as far as to victim shame Tristan, at least in my personal opinion, saying that he is the one who should have contacted the sheriff's department before going to this campsite to ask if it was dangerous to camp there. And when I heard that, I was like, man, the restraint it must have taken Erica to hear that and not lose her on every single person there. If something is unsafe, if there have been shootings, attacks in an area, law enforcement, they're the ones who know about it. They're the ones that should say, hey, we've got something weird going on here. At your own discretion, go to this park. Like, you make your own informed decision. People shouldn't have to call the sheriff's department before they go camping at a place thought to be safe, where there's been no public account of there being issues, to be like, hey, by the way, is this place safe? Like, do they really want to open that can of worms? Because in that case, I think before we all go anywhere, we should all just start calling our local sheriff's department and be like, hey, you know what? I'm actually about to head to the grocery store, but I just want to make sure with you first that it's safe. Like, I so wish they had taken the petty route in this situation and called the sheriff's department every single time any of them went anywhere, because that is the dumbest way to brush off their own personal responsibility. But unfortunately, in 2021, Erica's lawsuit was dismissed under sovereign immunity, which I'm sure none of us are surprised about. And if you're not aware, sovereign immunity protects the government from liability unless a very, very specific law or duty has been violated. So despite the mounting evidence, despite the admissions from deputies, despite the death of an innocent father in front of his children, no one was held responsible for keeping the public in the dark. The person responsible was in prison, but the fact it could have been avoided, apparently no one was going to do a single damn thing about that. But it wasn't just Erica who tried to hold the system accountable, but there was also Detective James Royal and Deputy Wright. Now, Royal in particular had tried to escalate the issue internally. As I've already said, he even compiled notes. He connected the incidents. They were urging supervisors to issue a public safety warning and close the park so there could be a full investigation. But again, as I already said, he was told it wasn't their problem. Royal was apparently told that the state parks department was responsible for that campground. Both of them had repeatedly been ignored and dismissed. And then Tristan was killed. Suddenly, the department had a media firestorm on their hands, and who better to lead the community briefing than Detective Royal? So that public meeting that they had, they so specifically chose Royal to lead the entire thing, knowing he had already raised red flags. He said he thought there was an issue and that these were connected, and specifically ordered him to say that they weren't. And Royal continued pushing anyway, and that's when they ultimately found Rauda, and at that point, they were no longer seen as dramatic. All of a sudden, they were hailed as heroes. Both Wright and Rauda were even promised medals for their role in helping identify Rauda and arrest him and push to solve these cases. But as fast as they turned heroes, they turned back to enemies, because once the public and the Beaudette family started pushing against the department because of the lack of transparency, the department realized they had not one, but two weak links. Wright and Royal found themselves the targets of internal investigations. Royal was stripped of his detective rank, transferred 80 miles away, and given awful shifts. The same with Wright, and one of them was sent to Disney or Universal as security, and they believed it was punishment for trying to tell the truth. I mean, years and years of work, of being in the same department, and they were tossed out the moment they were deemed a liability. So they too filed a lawsuit against the department. Royal did file this in 2019, so around the same time that Erica Wu put forward her lawsuit. However, they put a stay on it. They actually wanted the entire trial for Anthony Rauda to go through before they continued with Royal's lawsuit. So his lawsuit wasn't actually looked at or allowed to proceed until 2023. I know that Wright's separate lawsuit was settled. However, none of that information has been shared, but Royals is still going. It is still pending. So I'm interested to see how that ends up going because everything about that is so incredibly wrong. Tristan Beaudette was a father, a husband, a scientist, and a friend. He was the kind of guy that packed up the car for a weekend of memories, who took his daughters camping so his wife could study in peace. He was present and joyful and intentional with his time. What happened to him wasn't random. It was the result of silence. Silence from those who had the warning. Silence from systems that were meant to protect families like this. And that silence came at an unbearable cost. His daughters didn't just lose their dad. They lost the man who read them bedtime stories, who made them breakfast on Sunday mornings, who held their hands through all of these little firsts that they had. And Erica didn't just lose her husband. She lost the partner that she had grown up with, the one that she had just looked at on Father's Day and thought, man, like this is the dream. I am so lucky to have him. And that dream was shattered. And all of it was so preventable. In my opinion, the failure wasn't just the gunman hiding in the hills. It was every single warning that was ignored and every single family that went unprotected. And if I were living in this area, I would be mad as hell until someone took some sort of public accountability for it. And Tristan's story, his life, his love, and his loss deserves to be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a call for this community to do better, for these officers to do better. Because families should never, ever have to be the ones that pay the price for someone else's silence. And that is why I wanted to share this story today, because I read it and was in such disbelief that I'd never heard of this case before, that I didn't see more people talking about it, because what's happening in that area is not right, especially knowing that there are so many celebrities and people with big voices living in that area. I just feel like they should be using them. And, you know, I'm not one to keep up with Hollywood and all those things. So maybe they have, and I just didn't stumble across it in my research. But I just feel like there should be more accountability happening here. And I am heartbroken for Tristan and his family and every other person that suffered from these shootings that has felt like no one has given an absolute crap about it. But it also makes me so incredibly proud of the community, of people like CeCe Woods that hear these things and recognize that there's a problem, and they don't stop talking about it until something is done. Because ultimately, I do think that helped make such a big difference. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and I think if they hadn't continued screaming about this, this department would have let this go on unsolved, unquestioned, for who knows how long. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to not just Tristan's story, but the story of all of these people that were victims of this senseless and preventable tragedy. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.